The word landed on her like a stone dropped into still water, and Beatrice Kendrick felt the ripples move through every part of her before she fully understood what had happened. "Beautiful," Aaron Malone had said, standing in the middle of her dry goods store with dust on his coat and sun leather on his hands, saying it the way a man might say the sky was blue or the creek was cold. Not as flattery, not as manipulation, not as a trap she should be watching for. He had said it like a fact he was simply reporting to the world, the way you'd note the direction of the wind or the height of a fence post. He had turned from the window where he'd been looking out at the street and looked at her directly, and the word had simply come out of him, easy and certain. "Beautiful," he had said, and Beatrice had felt something inside her chest crack open like old, dried wood. She had not heard that word aimed at her in 8 years. Not since James had said it the morning he left for the war, standing on the porch of the home they just started building, his uniform still smelling of new dye, his face young and unafraid and full of the kind of love that did not yet understand what was coming. He had cupped her face in both hands, James had, and looked at her the way a man looks at the thing he most fears losing, and he had said it then. Beautiful. He had said it like a prayer. That morning was 1864. The letter came in the autumn of 1865 and said that James Kendrick had been killed at 5 Forks, and after that nobody said the word to Beatrice again. Not in all the years that followed. Not through the grief that had hollowed her out like rot hollows a tree, leaving something that still stood upright but was empty inside. Not through the rebuilding, when she had taken every last dollar they'd saved and used it to buy out the Halstead Mercantile in Dunnmore, Texas, in 1870, because she needed something to do with her hands or she would lose her mind entirely. Not through the 5 years she had run that store alone, keeping the books, ordering the supplies, negotiating with the cattlemen and the railroad men and the rough-handed men who came in thinking a widow woman would be easy to cheat and always found out otherwise. Not one man in all of those years had said that word to her. And now this stranger, this Aaron Malone who had ridden into Dunnmore 3 weeks ago on a horse the color of dark honey and had bought a room at the Caldwell boarding house and asked around about work, this man who was 29 years old to her 28 and who carried a secret behind his eyes like a locked room, he had simply said it, plain as weather. Beatrice had stared at him. Aaron had blinked, looking slightly startled himself, as though the word had escaped him without his full permission. Then he had squared his jaw and held her gaze, and she had understood in that moment that he was not going to take it back. He was not the sort of man who took things back. "I apologize if that was forward," he said, but his voice was steady and he did not look sorry particularly. "It was," she said. "Yes," he nodded once. "I expect it was." And then, because she did not know what else to do with the weight of that one word, Beatrice had turned back to her inventory ledger and pretended she was going to keep counting bolts of calico, and Aaron Malone had placed his coins on the counter for the tobacco he'd come in to buy and walked back out into the Texas afternoon, and the bell above the door had rung once as he left. She put her pen down and pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed. 8 years. She had not been called beautiful in 8 years, and the man who had said it to her now was someone she barely knew, someone who had arrived in Dunnmore carrying a history he had not offered to any of them, someone who, if she was being honest with herself, she had been watching out of the corner of her eye for 3 weeks in a way that made her feel guilty and frightened, and more alive than she had felt since 1864. She needed to be very careful. She needed to be careful because she recognized, in a way that felt like recognizing the smell of rain before it arrived, that she was already in danger of losing herself to something she could not afford to lose herself to. She picked up her pen. She could not write a single number. Dunnmore, Texas in the year 1875 was a town that had nearly died twice and survived both times out of pure stubbornness. It sat at the edge of the Caprock country, where the flat plains gave way to the rolling breaks, and the scrub cedar began to assert itself, a small but determined settlement of 300 souls that had grown up around a water source and a crossroads and the sheer human need to gather somewhere. The war had taken a third of its men. The drought of 1870 had taken 3 families. And still Dunnmore stood, its main street unpaved and rutted from the cattle drives that moved through it twice a year, its handful of buildings solid and practical, its people worn smooth by hard use but not beaten. Beatrice had arrived in 1870 with her grief and her savings and a stubbornness that matched the town's own, and she had made the mercantile work. She had made herself indispensable. She had become the person in Dunnmore that other people organized around, the way people organize around a strong post in the middle of a room, leaning on it without quite noticing they were doing so. She kept credit for families in hard months. She knew which children needed shoes and found ways to provide them without making the parents feel ashamed. She had opinions about town governance and was not shy about them. She had built a life here out of what was left after the war had taken what she'd planned for, and it was a good life, a real life, one she was proud of. She had simply stopped expecting it to include certain things. The warmth of another person who chose to be near her, the specific kind of being seen that came with love. She had stopped expecting to be called beautiful. She had told herself this was fine. She had told herself, in the quiet of her apartment above the store where she lived alone, that she was complete, that she did not need what she had given up hoping for. She had been managing to believe this right up until 3 weeks ago. Aaron Malone had come into the store on a Tuesday morning in early October, which was when the light came through the eastern window at a low slant and turned everything it touched to gold, and he had needed rope and hardtack and a new clasp knife. And he had stood at her counter and looked around the store with the slow, assessing eyes of a man who evaluated everything out of old habit and found it good, and he had said, "You run this place yourself?" "I do," she had said. "How long?" "5 years." He had nodded, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. "It shows," he had said. "The place has been kept well," and he had paid for his goods and gone, and Beatrice had not thought much of it except that he was polite and had the manner of a man who said what he meant and no more, which was a quality she respected. But he came back. He came back the following Thursday for salt and flour, and again the Thursday after that for a new tin cup to replace the one he'd apparently lost, and each time he came he stayed a few minutes longer than the errand required, browsing the shelves with genuine interest, asking occasional questions about the town or the territory with the attentiveness of someone who was building a picture of a place he intended to stay in. He was not flirtatious. He was not attempting to charm her. He was simply, somehow, present in a way that she found herself thinking about afterward. She had learned, through the natural intelligence network of a small town, certain facts about him. He had come from Oklahoma Territory, which was itself interesting in 1875, because Oklahoma Territory meant either he had been involved in some capacity with the Indian lands and the complicated politics that surrounded them, or he had come through them to get somewhere else. He had served in the war, which was visible to anyone who knew how to look, in the particular way certain men moved and stood and went still in the presence of loud noise. He had been a scout, someone said, or possibly a surveyor. He had inquired about land. He was looking to settle. He was, as far as anyone in Dunnmore could determine, entirely alone in the world. This last fact lodged itself somewhere in Beatrice's chest where she did not particularly want it. She was good at being alone. She had made herself expert at it. But she recognized loneliness in other people with the sensitivity of someone who had spent years trying to hide her own, and Aaron Malone was the loneliest man she had ever looked at. He wore it the way he wore his coat, fully, without complaint, having made his peace with the fact of it. But it was there. She found herself wondering about his dark past. She found herself wanting to know what hidden sorrows had brought him to Dunnmore with that locked-room look in his eyes. And the wanting frightened her, because it meant something was already happening that she was not sure she could stop. The day after he said the word, The day after Beautiful had cracked something open in her and left her standing at her counter, unable to count, Beatrice Kendrick did something she had not done in 5 years. She closed the store at noon on a Wednesday, which she never did, and she walked out to the edge of town where the land opened up into the breaks, and she stood at the lip of the caprock where you could see for 20 miles in 3 directions, and she had what she could only describe as a serious conversation with herself. The argument on one side was straightforward. She was 28 years old. She had not been in love since James, and James had been dead for 10 years. She had built herself a life that was real and good, and it did not include the terrifying, destabilizing, soul-altering experience of caring deeply about another person who could be taken away by a war or a fever or a horse or any of the 1,000 things that could take a person. She had survived losing James by becoming someone who did not need to survive that kind of loss again. She was competent and independent, and she had, for the most part, stopped hurting so much. The argument on the other side was also straightforward, and it was that she was 28 years old and she was standing at the edge of a caprock alone on a Wednesday at noon talking to herself while 20 miles of open country lay before her, and she had not been called beautiful in 8 years. And the man who had said it like he meant it, like it was just true, like she was the sky, and being beautiful was simply what the sky did. She stood there for a long time. She went back to the store and opened it at 2 o'clock and told herself nothing was going to happen, and believed this almost entirely. Aaron Malone came in Thursday morning at 9, which was earlier than usual. He looked like he hadn't slept well, which she chose not to notice. He bought a small bag of coffee beans and a new length of leather cord, and he was just turning to go when he stopped himself and turned back and looked at her directly in the way he had that made her feel pinned. "I've been thinking about what I said," he told her. "You don't need to explain yourself," she said, which was what she had decided to say. "I know I don't," he said. "I wanted to say that I meant it and I'm not sorry I said it." She looked at him for a moment. "You should probably know," she said, "that my husband called me that before the war, and I haven't heard it since." Something moved across his face, pain, she thought, or its near cousin. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and she could tell from the way he said it that he understood loss personally, not merely as a polite concept. "It was a long time ago," she said. "Some things don't care how long ago they were," he said. She had no answer for that because it was exactly true. He nodded once and put his hand briefly on the counter, not quite touching hers, the way you might make a gesture that falls just short of contact, because completing it would mean something you're not yet certain you have permission to mean. And then he went out into the morning, and the bell rang, and Beatrice stood still for a full 3 minutes before she was able to move again. There was a man named Cole Whitmore in Dunnmore who occupied the position of unofficial obstacle in Beatrice's life. He was 41 years old and owned 300 acres east of town and the largest herd of cattle in the county, and he had been making his interest in Beatrice known in various ways for 2 years. Not through courtship. Exactly, Cole Whitmore was not a man given to romance or any of its attendant vulnerability, but through a kind of proprietorial attention that made Beatrice feel watched and slightly cornered. He came into the store more often than his supply needs required. He made comments about her situation that implied she would eventually arrive at the sensible conclusion that she needed a man to manage things properly, a conclusion she rejected every time with the cold politeness of a woman who has been managing things properly for 5 years without any help. She did not like Cole Whitmore. She had tried to, because disliking someone who lived 3 miles away and controlled a significant part of the local economy was inconvenient, but she had not been able to manage it. Cole Whitmore noticed Aaron Malone. More specifically, he noticed that Aaron Malone had taken to being in the store when Whitmore himself came in, which happened with increasing frequency. Once word filtered back to Whitmore that the new man was spending time in Beatrice's company. Whitmore came in on the Friday after the Beautiful incident, and Aaron was there, not buying anything in particular, simply leaning against the end of the shelving unit near the window and talking to Beatrice about whether the Caprock country was likely to get good water from a well at a particular depth he'd been considering. Whitmore walked in, and the air in the room changed. Beatrice felt it the way you feel a shift in weather, a cooling, a pulling back of light. She had years of experience with Cole Whitmore's arrivals. "Mrs. Kendrick," Whitmore said, not looking at Aaron, which was itself a kind of looking. "Mr. Whitmore," Beatrice said evenly. "What can I help you with?" "Need a few things." He put a list on the counter. His eyes moved to Aaron then, assessing, the way a man assesses something he considers a rival and doesn't want to grant that status to. "Don't believe I know you," he said. Aaron looked at him with the calm of someone who had been looked at that way many times and had developed a comfortable relationship with the experience. "Aaron Malone," he said. "Cole Whitmore. I run the Whitmore Ranch east of town." He said this the way some men say such things, as an establishment of territory. "I've heard of it," Aaron said, which was true, and said nothing else. The silence that followed was of the variety that has things in it. Beatrice busied herself with Whitmore's list and let it sit there without helping it, which she felt was the dignified thing to do. Whitmore turned back to the counter. "I've been meaning to speak to you, Mrs. Kendrick," he said, using the formal address in a way that was meant to establish something. "About the east wall of your store. The foundation's been settling. I could send some of my men over." "Thank you," Beatrice said. "I have someone looking at it." She did not, in fact, have someone looking at it, and the foundation had been settling slightly for 2 years and was not causing any significant problem. But she smiled pleasantly and began filling his order. After Whitmore left, Aaron said nothing for a moment. Then, "You don't like him." "I didn't say that." "No," he agreed. She looked at him. "He has been deciding for some time that he knows what's best for my situation," she said. "I find it tedious." Aaron nodded slowly. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read, something that might have been protectiveness if she'd been willing to name it. A woman who runs her own business well shouldn't have to spend time defending her ability to do so, he said simply. "No," she agreed. "She shouldn't." He pushed off the shelving and picked up his hat. "I'll be out of your way," he said. "You're not in my way," she said, and then heard herself say it and looked back down at the counter, and when she looked up again he was watching her with an expression she was almost able to read. He was not in her way. That was the problem exactly. He was not in her way at all. He was in the adjacent space to her way, occupying it with a quiet consistency that she had begun to organize around the way plants will begin to organize around light, almost without choosing to, simply because it is there, and it is warm. November arrived in Dunnmore with a cold wind from the north and the kind of sky that looked like pewter hammered flat. The cattle drives had finished for the year, and the town was settling into its winter quiet, fewer strangers passing through, the rhythm of things slowing to match the season. Beatrice began ordering the goods she'd need to last through to spring, making her calculations with the careful intelligence of someone who had learned that mistakes in ordering meant real hardship for real people who counted on her store being stocked when the roads got bad. Aaron had, during October, found work helping a rancher named Pete Gallagher shore up his barn and do some fence work on the eastern pasture, which gave him something to do and a reason to stay, though Beatrice was aware he did not particularly need a reason. He had found his reasons. She could see it in the way he talked about the land, about the particular quality of the Caprock country, about the way the light moved over the breaks in the morning. He was a man falling in love with a place, and watching that was its own kind of intimacy. He had not said another word that cracked anything open in her, but that was almost worse, because the word was still there, sitting in the air between them like something neither of them was pretending it wasn't. She invited him to dinner, which surprised both of them. She had meant to invite Pete Gallagher and his wife over for Sunday supper, which she did occasionally as a social courtesy, and in explaining to Pete that she was extending the invitation she had added, almost without deciding to, "And bring Mr. Malone if he'd like to come." And Pete had looked at her with the particular knowing look of a man who had been married for 20 years and recognized certain things. And she had looked back at him with an expression of complete neutrality that she maintained right up until she was alone again. They came, all four of them, on a Sunday in the first week of November, and Beatrice cooked the kind of meal she cooked when she was trying to feel capable and in control: roasted beef from the butcher down the street, sweet potatoes, cornbread, apple preserves from the stock she kept behind the counter. She set the table in the apartment above the store with the good dishes she had carried from Virginia in 1870 and barely used, and she lit 2 candles, and she told herself it was simply hospitality. Pete and his wife Sarah were comfortable company, the kind of people who took up exactly the right amount of space and filled silence easily without demanding anything from you. Aaron came in after them and stopped in the doorway of the small dining room and looked at the table with those careful eyes of his, and then looked at Beatrice with an expression she finally fully recognized. It was gratitude, not for the meal but for the invitation, for being included, for being treated as a person who was worth cooking the good dishes for. She felt briefly like crying, which she absolutely did not do. Instead, she poured the coffee and said, "Sit wherever you like," and they sat. It was one of the finest evenings Beatrice had spent since before the war. They talked about the territory, about the changes that were coming as the railroad pushed further west, about the politics of the land out here which were always complicated and frequently unjust. The Comanche had been pushed off the Caprock country barely a year before, in 1874, and the wound of that was still raw in anyone who was paying attention, and Aaron paid attention. He spoke about it with a directness that surprised Pete and delighted Beatrice, because most men in Texas in 1875 talked around the removal of the indigenous people from the land as though it were weather that had happened rather than choices that had been made. And Aaron Malone simply said that taking land from people who had lived on it for generations and doing it by force was wrong, and that it would have consequences that would outlast everyone at this table. "That's a strong opinion for a man who's looking to buy land out here," Pete said, without hostility. "Buying land in good faith from its legal sellers is different from what the Army did," Aaron said. "I can hold both of those things." Beatrice watched him say this and felt something settle into certainty in her chest. After Pete and Sarah had gone home into the cold November night, Aaron stayed to help carry the dishes, which she had not asked him to do. They washed the dishes together in the small kitchen, and the domesticity of it was so sharp she felt it in her sternum. He washed and she dried, and they did not talk for a few minutes, and it was comfortable, which was almost worse than if it had been awkward. "You're not just passing through," she said. She meant it as a question, but it came out as a statement. "No," he said, handing her a plate. "Why Dunnmore?" He considered this for longer than a simple answer would require, which told her the real answer was not the simple one. "I came through here in 1869, he said finally. "On my way to somewhere I ended up not staying, but I remembered it. I remembered the country and the quality of it, and I needed to find somewhere to—" He stopped. "To what?" she asked. He dried his hands on the cloth she kept hanging by the basin and looked at her steadily. "To stop," he said. "I've been moving a long time. I needed somewhere that felt worth stopping for." She held the plate she was drying and looked at him and asked the question that had been sitting in her for 3 weeks. "What are you carrying?" She said, "What's the dark past that's in your eyes?" He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she might have pushed past what he'd allow, but then he said, "I lost people in the war, a whole unit, men I was responsible for." He said it flatly, the way you say things you've made your peace with but not your complete peace. "I was a sergeant. I made a call in the dark that turned out to be wrong, and 8 men died because of it. 5 Forks, April '65. The plate nearly dropped. Beatrice caught it. She stared at him. "5 Forks, she said. "Yes. My husband died at 5 Forks. The silence was enormous. Aaron went very still. She could see him absorbing the weight of this, the terrible coincidence of it, the way it connected them through grief in a way neither of them had chosen or expected. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the most loaded 2 words she'd ever heard a person speak, because she understood that he was sorry for James specifically as well as generally. Sorry in the way a man who carries survivor's guilt is sorry when he meets a woman who lost someone in the same hours he lost his men. "It wasn't your fault," she said, because she didn't know the specifics, but she knew that already, the same way she'd always known James's death wasn't anyone's individual fault but was the sum of all the choices that had made the war in the first place. "No," he said, "but I've had some difficulty making my heart believe that." She understood this completely. She set the plate on the stack and turned and looked at him. "James would have been 31 this year," she said. "The men in my unit were 21 to 33, he said. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, connected by the specific, irreversible shape of what the war had taken from both of them. And it was not a romantic moment exactly. It was too honest for that, too close to bone, but it was real in a way that very few moments of Beatrice's life since 1865 had been real, because someone was standing in front of her who understood from the inside what it meant to carry this weight. "Stay," she said, and then quickly, because she needed to qualify it, "for another cup of coffee, if you'd like." He stayed for another 2 hours. Cole Whitmore's proprietorial interest hardened into something more specific in the second week of November, when it became commonly known in Dunnmore that Aaron Malone had been seen leaving Beatrice Kendrick's store at 10 o'clock at night, which was technically accurate and completely misleading, since the context was a long conversation about land rights and territorial law that had simply run late. But in a town of 300 people, context was sometimes the casualty of observation, and Whitmore heard what he heard and interpreted it as a challenge to something he had been thinking of as his. He came to the store on a Monday morning with 2 of his ranch hands, which was the first thing that was wrong, because Cole Whitmore never brought men with him to buy dry goods. He stood at her counter and did not buy anything and said, with the false civility of a man who is angry and trying to appear reasonable, "Mrs. Kendrick, I want to give you some friendly advice." "I appreciate the thought," she said, which was not agreeing to listen. "This man Malone," he said, "nobody knows him. He hasn't said where he came from, what his business is, why he's hanging around a widow woman's store. He has explained his business to me," she said, "and to several other people in town. He is looking to settle on land in this county. This is generally considered acceptable." She kept her voice pleasant. She was very good at pleasant. "A woman in your position," Whitmore began. "I will stop you there," Beatrice said, and her voice shifted just slightly, just enough to let him know that pleasant had its limits. "I am 28 years old and I have run this establishment successfully for 5 years, and I do not need a man's advice about who is or is not appropriate company. I have found Mr. Malone to be an honest and intelligent person, and my assessment of that matters considerably more than your suspicion of it." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "I have a genuine interest in your welfare," he said. "I know you believe that," she said. "I would ask you to consider whether what you have is an interest in my welfare or an interest in my circumstances." She held his gaze steadily. "They are not the same thing." He left without saying much more, but the ranch hands behind him exchanged a look as they went out, and Beatrice stood behind her counter feeling the particular combination of righteous satisfaction and mild fear that came with having drawn a line clearly. Because Cole Whitmore was a man who was accustomed to getting what he decided he wanted, and she had now made it clear that she was not available to be gotten, and that information did not sit well with certain kinds of men. She told Aaron about it that Thursday. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, and when she was done he said, "Has he done anything that crosses a legal line?" "Not yet," she said. "Then the best thing is to keep going exactly as you are." He paused. "But I want you to know that if he does something that crosses a line, I would like to be someone you'd come to." She looked at him. "You don't need to protect me," she said. "I know that," he said, and he said it clearly enough that she believed him. "That's not what I'm offering. I'm offering to be on your side. There's a difference." She thought about this. There was a difference. She had spent 5 years having people offer to protect her from things they had decided she couldn't handle, and she had spent 5 years demonstrating that this assessment was wrong, and none of it had ever felt like what Aaron Malone was describing, which was the simpler and more dignified thing of being on her side. "All right," she said. "I'll come to you." He nodded, and there was something in his face that was satisfied in the way of a man who has been allowed to matter. December came in cold and clear, and with it came the news that Aaron had found land. It was 40 acres southeast of Dunnmore, sitting just at the edge of the caprock with a view of the breaks that was, by any honest account, remarkable, and it had a small stone house on it that a previous family had abandoned after 2 hard years, the house being in rough shape but structurally sound, and it had 2 wells that gave good water at reasonable depth. He had bought it from the county land office for $32 and had spent the first 2 weeks of December beginning the work of making the house habitable, which meant he was now in Dunnmore not as a temporary resident with a room at the boarding house, but as a neighbor with a property and a stake in the place. He came into the store that first Friday in December with sawdust on his coat and the look of a man who had been working hard and was genuinely happy about it, and the sight of him like that did something to Beatrice that she was done pretending was not happening. "The east wall is going to need new chinking," he said, "but the roof is solid and the floors are good pine. I think it could be fine." "It can be," she said. "I know that property. The family that had it, the Garners, they left in '72. The land is good if you work it right." He bought a substantial load of supplies that day: nails, lamp oil, caulking compound, a new hinge set, several lengths of chain, sugar and salt and flour in quantities that said he was planning to be there for a while, and as she tallied it all up, she was aware of the fact that she was provisioning his home, which was an intimate thing even when you were doing it in the entirely professional context of a mercantile transaction. "You'll want to get window glass in before the worst of the winter," she said. "I know." "Can you order it? I have some in stock, 3 pane sizes. I can bring a selection by if you want a measure." She stopped herself. "Or I can give you the measurements and you can come choose." "Bring them by," he said. "I'd like you to see it if you'd be willing." She was willing. She was, in fact, more willing than she wanted to examine closely. She went out on Saturday morning with her horse and the glass panes wrapped carefully in sacking, and she rode the 3 miles to the Garner property that was now the Malone property, and she understood why he had chosen it the moment she came over the last rise and saw it. The small stone house sat on a level piece of ground with the caprock rising behind it and the breaks falling away to the south and east, and the morning light was doing what December light did out here, which was come in low and golden and find every surface and make it luminous. The house was rough-edged and needed work, but it had bones, the same way certain faces have bones that make them remarkable no matter how the years have treated them. And Aaron was standing in front of it with a hammer in his hand, having heard her approach, and the whole picture of it, the house, the land, the man standing in front of it in the early morning light, hit her with a force that she felt in her entire body. She climbed down from her horse and walked the perimeter of the house with him, measuring windows and making notes in her small leather-covered notebook, and he showed her the work he'd done and explained what remained, and she made practical suggestions about insulation and draft management in the west-facing walls, and it was entirely practical and enormously intimate, and she was not fooling herself about either of those things anymore. Standing in what would be the kitchen at a window that looked south over the breaks, she said, "This is going to be a fine home." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "It would be finer with company." She kept her eyes on the view. "That's a large statement for a Thursday morning," she said, because it was Thursday in her heart even if it was Saturday. "Saturday," he corrected gently, and she heard the small smile in his voice. She turned and looked at him. "I'm not a man who is good at saying things in the right order," he said. "I said beautiful before I'd said good morning. I'm saying finer with company before I've said—" He stopped. What I want to say is that I came to Dunnmore because the land pulled me back, but I stayed because you gave me a reason to. And I understand that you have built your life entirely by your own hands and your own judgment, and you don't require a man to make it complete. I know that. I'm not suggesting otherwise. He looked at her steadily. I am suggesting that I would like to be in it, if that's something you could want. Beatrice looked at him for a long time. She looked at his hands, which were capable and scarred. She looked at his eyes, which had the locked-room quality, but the door was, she now understood, not locked to her. She thought about James, whom she had loved deeply and lost completely and would love forever in the specific, finished way you love people who are gone. She thought about 8 years of managing and enduring, and being competent at the expense of being soft. She thought about the word beautiful said plain as fact in the middle of her store, cracking her open. I have been afraid, she said, of caring about another person who could be taken away. I know, he said. I have been afraid of the same thing. That's a terrible basis for a beginning, she said. Or a very honest one, he said. She breathed. Outside the window, the brakes caught the morning light and held it. A hawk was working a thermal somewhere above the caprock, barely moving, simply riding what the air gave it. I think you should ask me to dinner, she said. The relief that moved across his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Will you have dinner with me, Beatrice? He said, using her first name for the first time, and it sounded right in his voice. It sounded like it fit, and she felt her own name as something warm and wanted. I will, she said. Cole Whitmore's interference came on the last day of the year. She had not been naive enough to think it wouldn't. She had simply hoped it would take a form that was manageable. It took the form of a conversation with the county land assessor, a man named Horace Greer, who owed Whitmore money, and was not above letting that affect his professional conduct. The conversation produced, through means that Beatrice only partially understood but fully recognized as corrupt, a notice that the Kendrick mercantile had been assessed at a new property value that would significantly increase the taxes due on the 1st of March. An increase substantial enough that it would have created serious difficulty for her operating budget. She found out on a Monday when Greer's man dropped the notice through her letter slot, and she read it twice and then sat down behind the counter on her stool and thought clearly and coldly about her options. She could pay it, which would strain her finances for the entire next season. She could contest it, which required legal knowledge she did not have and time she could not easily spare. She could go to Cole Whitmore and let him make the problem go away, which was what this was designed to make her do. She was not going to do that last one. She went to Aaron. She was not going to him because she needed protecting. She was going because she had told him she would come to him if something crossed a line, and this crossed a line, and she was a woman who kept her word. She rode out to his property that evening with the notice in her pocket and found him working on the east wall of the house by lantern light, because he had been doing that, working in whatever light he had, making the house ready. She told him what had happened. He listened with the stillness he always had, and when she was done he said, "What year is the actual assessed value from?" 1872, she said. They haven't updated it in 3 years. And the legal basis for reassessment. He cited an improvement clause, but there have been no improvements made to the structure in 3 years. Aaron thought for a moment. There's a land and property attorney in Abilene named William Croft, he said. I met him when I was filing my land claim. He's competent and honest, which is a rarer combination than it should be. I can write to him tonight. He can advise on contesting the assessment through the county records. That takes time, she said. Yes, he said. In the meantime, is there anything in your account that would cover a partial payment to keep them from acting on it? Possibly. I'd have to look at where I'm sitting. He nodded. Then he said carefully, if there's a gap, I have some savings. I want to offer that clearly, not as charity and not as anything that comes with an obligation. Simply as what I have to offer a person I care about. She was quiet for a moment. I won't need it, she said, but I appreciate that you have it. I know you won't need it, he said. I know that. She looked at him in the lantern light, his hands against the new chinking he'd been applying, the cold December air around them both. "You always know that," she said, almost to herself. "What?" he said. "You always know that I don't need saving," she said. "Every time you offer something, you know I don't need it. You offer it anyway." He looked at her steadily. "Because there's a difference between needing something and being allowed to have it," he said. "You're allowed to have people on your side, Beatrice, even if you don't need them." She crossed the space between them and she kissed him, which was the first time, and it was cold outside and warm between them, and the lantern light made everything amber, and his hands came up to hold her face with a care that undid her entirely, the same way a word said plain as fact in the middle of a mercantile had undone her 2 months before, because both things were the same kind of honesty. When they stepped back, she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying. "Write to Mr. Croft tonight," she said finally. "I will," he said. She rode back to town in the cold dark, feeling more like herself than she had in a decade, which was the strange and specific miracle of having let someone in. January was cold, and January was the month that Aaron Malone properly courted Beatrice Kendrick in the public view of Dunnmore, Texas, which meant they were seen eating supper together at the hotel dining room on Friday evenings, and occasionally walking together along the main street in the afternoon, and sometimes sitting together in the church on Sundays, which was the most visible social declaration available in 1876 in a small Texas town. The town received this information with the warm approval of a community that had been watching Beatrice work herself to the bone alone for 5 years, and had been quietly hoping someone would come along who understood what she was worth. Sarah Gallagher said as much directly to Beatrice over coffee one afternoon, saying simply, "He looks at you the way Pete looks at me, and Pete and I have been happy for 20 years, which Beatrice filed away carefully because Sarah Gallagher was a shrewd and honest woman. Cole Whitmore received the information differently. He came into the store one January morning when Aaron happened not to be there, and he was cold in a way that was more honest than his previous false civility, and he said, "You are making a mistake, Mrs. Kendrick. You don't know this man." "I know him considerably better than I know most people," she said. "He has a history in Oklahoma territory that you haven't looked into," Whitmore said, and there was something in how he said it that made her understand he thought he had a card to play. "Then tell me what you think you know," she said, meeting his gaze. "He was involved in a land dispute up there," Whitmore said, "with a Cherokee family. He claimed a parcel that had been informally occupied for years." She looked at him steadily. "And what was the outcome of that dispute?" Whitmore blinked, because clearly the outcome had not been what he needed it to be. "He withdrew his claim," he said. "He withdrew his claim," Beatrice repeated, "because he found out the family had prior settlement and he stepped back." She had not known this story, but she was not surprised by how it ended. She would ask Aaron about it because she wanted to know everything about him, but it did not change her assessment. "Is there something else, Mr. Whitmore?" He looked at her for a long time. Then something shifted in him, some recognition of a wall he was not going to climb. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "I do," she said. He left, and she never had another conversation of that kind with him. He was at the store occasionally after that to buy genuine supplies, and he was civil, and in time he was merely a man she did business with and not a pressure in her life, and she considered that satisfactory. She did ask Aaron about the Cherokee land dispute. They were walking together on a Sunday afternoon in late January, the cold air clear and sharp and the land around them winter pale, when she told him what Whitmore had said. Aaron was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "A family named Walking Bear," he said. "I had filed a legal claim on a parcel that I'd surveyed, and after I filed I learned they'd been living in a cabin on the south edge of it for 4 years, since before the official survey boundaries were drawn. They had no written title, but they'd been there and worked the land." He looked at the ground as they walked. "I went and met them, an older man and his adult son and daughter. The daughter spoke English and translated. They thought I was going to run them off." "But you didn't," she said. "No, I withdrew the claim. I filed on a different parcel 2 miles north." He shrugged. "It was the right thing. They were there first. They'd built something. The law hadn't caught up to that, but the law is not always the same thing as what's right." Beatrice felt a warmth moving through her that had nothing to do with the air temperature. "The injustice of how this land was settled," she said quietly, "sits on me sometimes. The Comanche were removed from this exact ground barely a year ago." "Yes," he said, "and we are living on it now. I think the honest thing is to carry that knowledge and not pretend it away. To build something here that is good and decent, and to refuse to take part in more injustice where you can refuse it." She reached over and took his hand as they walked, which was the first time she had done that, and he closed his fingers around hers, and they walked on in the winter afternoon. And she thought about how this man had come into her life carrying guilt from the war and a loneliness that matched her own, and a fundamental honesty about what was right that she had never expected to find in the same person as all the rest of it. The letter from William Croft in Abilene arrived in the second week of February and confirmed that the tax reassessment had no valid legal basis, and that a formal objection filed with the county clerk and copied to the district land office in Austin would be sufficient to reverse it, which Beatrice did immediately. And by the end of February, the original assessment was restored and the matter was closed, and Horace Greer was quietly hoping nobody looked too closely at the paperwork trail. Beatrice closed the store on the afternoon. The notice of reversal arrived and went out to Aaron's property and told him, and he was shingling a section of the roof that had been letting in cold. And he came down from the roof and read the notice and looked at her with a satisfaction that was partly for her and partly for the simple, reliable fact that sometimes the right thing won. She looked at the house, which was unrecognizable now from the abandoned ruin she'd first seen in December. The east wall was solid, the windows were glazed, the roof was sound. There was smoke coming from the chimney because he'd gotten the fireplace working in January. There were curtains in one of the windows, plain cotton ones he'd bought from her store and hung himself. "You've made it a home," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "It's missing some things." She looked at him. "What things?" He looked at her for a moment. The February afternoon was cold, but the sun was out doing its low slant thing and everything was still and clear. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and took something out, something small, and held it in his open palm. It was a ring. A plain gold band, simple as you like, with a small dark red stone set in it. "I bought it in Abilene when I went to speak with Croft," he said. "I was probably getting ahead of myself. I have been told before that I say things before I've said the things that should come first." She looked at the ring and then at him. Her heart was doing something enormous and ungainly in her chest. "Beatrice," he said, and her name in his voice was still the warm and wanted thing it had been the first time. "I love you. I want to be clear about that first before anything else. Not because I need you to manage anything or because I think you require taking care of, but because you are the most honest and capable and remarkable person I have been near in my life, and you showed me what it looks like to build something real from what you have left after loss, and I want to spend my life near that. Near you." He paused. "Will you marry me?" She was quiet for long enough that she saw a flicker of uncertainty move across his face, and she realized she needed to speak. "Yes," she said, and the word came out of her easy and certain, the same way his word had come out in her store 4 months ago, plain as fact, just true. He put the ring on her finger, which was cold from the February air, and she looked at it on her hand and then at him, and she was crying, which she had not done in front of another person in more than 10 years, and he held her in both arms with his chin on her hair, and she let herself be held, which was its own kind of miracle. They were married in March of 1876. The ceremony was in the small Dunnmore church on a Saturday, the weather being a perfect blue-sky March day that felt like the land's approval, and nearly every person in town came, because a town that small has enough affection distributed through it that 2 people getting married functions as a celebration for everyone. Sarah Gallagher stood up with Beatrice and Pete stood up with Aaron, and the minister married them in 20 clear minutes with language that was plain and meant. And when it was done, Aaron looked at her with the expression she had started to know as his particular expression of deep, quiet joy. And she looked back at him with something she had not felt in so long that she'd nearly forgotten the shape of it, which was safety. Not the safety of protection, but the safety of being known. They had supper in the hotel dining room that evening with 30 people who loved them and wished them well, and there was music from a fiddle player named Thomas Reyes, who played Mexican and frontier songs intermingled in a way that made people want to move, and Beatrice danced with Aaron for the first time, which she had not known was something she'd been missing until it was happening. He danced the way he did most things, carefully, with full attention, without pretending to be better at it than he was. "I haven't danced since before the war," she told him. "Neither have I," he said. They danced anyway, imperfectly and gladly, and the fiddle played something slow and the lanterns made everything amber, and the world outside the dining room windows was dark and cold and wide, and inside was warm and full of light. They went home that night to the house on the Caprock property, which was her home now as well as his, and she brought her clothes and her books and the good dishes from Virginia and the ledger she kept for the store, because she was still running the mercantile and had no intention of stopping. Aaron had not suggested she stop. Aaron had suggested, in fact, that she could use the storage room at the property as an additional space if she needed to expand her inventory, which she thought was a very good idea. Spring came to the Caprock country the way it always did, dramatically and then all at once, the dry ground going from brown to green seemingly overnight, the wildflowers arriving in sheets of color across the breaks, the hawks back on the thermals, and the cattle looking fat and healthy after their winter grazing. Beatrice rode to the store each morning and rode home in the evenings and lived, for the first time in 11 years, inside a life that felt like it fit all the way around. She learned new things about Aaron continuously, which was a particular pleasure of being married to someone you had not known long. She learned that he read voraciously, a habit from his scouting years when he'd carry a single book for a month and read it 15 times and move on to the next, and that he had opinions about what he read that were strong and interesting and frequently contrary to conventional wisdom. She learned that he could cook 3 things well and everything else poorly, which she found endearing. She learned that he had a specific laugh that came out rarely, a real one that reached his eyes, and that she had apparently become skilled at triggering it. She learned that he woke early and stood at the window facing east to watch the light come up over the breaks, which she had started doing with him, standing with coffee in hand in the early dark and watching the sky go from black to purple to gold. She told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about the specific quality of her grief for James, how it had changed over the years from acute to chronic, and eventually to the kind of ache that was also a form of love that still existed, just redirected, like water finding a new course. She told him about the early years of the mercantile and how frightened she had been that it would fail, and the night she had sat alone in the store at 2 in the morning in the winter of '71 wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake. She told him about the first time she had realized she was going to be fine, actually fine, which was a spring morning in '72 when she had paid off the last of the debt she'd taken on to buy the business and walked out into the Dunnmore street with the receipt in her hand and felt something that was not happiness exactly but was its older, more durable cousin. He told her about the war in fragments over months, the way you tell things that are difficult a little at a time, checking to see if the ground holds before you add more weight. He told her about the men he'd been responsible for, and she listened with the care of someone who understood grief and did not try to fix it. He told her about 5 Forks specifically, the bad call in the dark, the morning after when he had understood what his decision had cost. She listened to this, and then she said, quietly, James died in a battle that had 100 decisions made by 100 different officers. His death was not the product of one man's mistake on one April night. But even if you had been the man who made that call, I would not hold it against you, because I can see exactly who you are, and you are not a man who made a careless choice. You are a man who made an imperfect one in impossible conditions and then carried it for 11 years. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "You are the first person who has made me believe I could put that down." "Put it down," she said. "It doesn't serve you anymore." He didn't put it down overnight, or in a week, or even in a month, because that is not how such things work. But she watched it shift over the months of their first year together, watched the locked room quality in his eyes become less locked, the door more often open. In the summer of 1876, they got news of the Battle of Little Bighorn, which rolled through the nation in waves of shock and political consequence. And Aaron and Beatrice sat with it together in the complicated way of people who understood both the specific horror of soldiers dying and the broader horror of what the army was being used to do on behalf of a government that had broken treaty after treaty with people who had lived on the land for thousands of years. It was a grief that had layers, and they sat with all of them. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," Aaron said. "Yes," Beatrice agreed. "I think it will." She paused. "But there will be people in every generation who try to make it better. We can be two of them in the ways available to us." He looked at her. "How?" She thought about it. "Honest business," she said. "Fair dealing, not cheating people who come through, teaching whatever children we have to think past what's convenient." She met his eyes, speaking plainly when something is wrong. He nodded slowly. "We can do that." In the fall of that year, Beatrice discovered she was expecting a child. She told Aaron on a Thursday evening. It was always Thursdays for them somehow, the day that things happened, when they were sitting together after supper, and she just said it plainly, the way he said things. "I believe we are expecting a baby." He went very still, the way he went still when something large was happening, and then something moved across his face that she had not seen on it before, a openness that was startling in its completeness, and he reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "Are you?" he started. "I'm well," she said. "I'm healthy. She paused, examining herself honestly. "I'm frightened a little and glad, both." "Both?" he said, as though this exactly matched what he was feeling. She was. She was frightened in the way that anyone who loves something is frightened of losing it, the old wound of that. But she was glad in a way that went down to the root of her, because this was the life she was building and this was the next part of it, and she was not the same person she'd been 8 years ago, the person who had survived loss by making herself impervious to hope. She was someone who had let herself hope again, carefully, with full knowledge of the risk, and the risk had not, so far, resulted in loss. It had resulted in this. She kept running the store through the winter, which various people in town had opinions about, most of them unsolicited, and all of them addressed to her with a speed that suggested they had been waiting for the opportunity. She listened politely and continued running the store, because she was fine, and the work was not difficult in the ways that would matter. And she had hired a young woman named Clara Webb in November to help with the heavier lifting and the stocking of shelves, which addressed the practical concerns. Aaron was attentive through the winter in the particular way. He was attentive to all things, which was fully and without making a performance of it. He made sure there was always wood for the fire and that she had everything she needed and that she was not doing more than was sensible. But he did none of this in ways that made her feel managed or limited, which she knew was something he thought carefully about. He was simply present and capable and on her side. Their son was born in May of 1877 in the house on the Caprock, assisted by Dunnmore's doctor and Sarah Gallagher. He was healthy and loud about it, and Beatrice held him in the May morning light and felt something that she did not have adequate words for, a love that was completely different from anything she had loved before, enormous and terrifying and joyful and complete. They named him James Aaron Malone. Aaron looked at her when she said the name, and she looked back at him and said, He carried something worth honoring. This seemed right to me, if you're willing." "I'm more than willing," Aaron said, and she heard in his voice the laying down of a weight that had been very long carried, the specific grace of having grief honored rather than competed with. James Aaron Malone was a cheerful and curious baby who grew into a cheerful and curious small person with his father's careful eyes and his mother's stubbornness, which combination was clearly going to make him an interesting adult. He had Aaron's coloring and Beatrice's particular expression of determined concentration, and he liked horses from the moment he was old enough to be safely near one, which Aaron took as an extremely good sign. The mercantile continued to grow in those years because Dunnmore was growing. The railroad came closer to the county in 1878, which brought new people and new commerce, and Beatrice expanded the store in 1879, taking on the adjacent space that had been empty and converting it into an expanded dry goods operation with a small section in the back for hardware and tools. She hired 2 people full-time. She was one of the most successful independent business operators in the county, and the county assessor, a new one now, Horace Greer, having retired into obscurity, valued the property correctly and without drama. Aaron had built up the property those years into something that was genuinely productive, not a cattle operation on Whitmore's scale, but a working combination of a few dozen cattle and some grain, and a kitchen garden that Beatrice tended with the same organized intelligence she applied to everything, and horses, which he had a genuine gift with, and the horse trading and training had become a secondary income that he took pleasure in. They were not rich. They were better than comfortable, and they were useful to their community, and they were home in a place they had each chosen deliberately. And on the evenings when they sat together on the porch of the stone house with the breaks falling away to the south and the last light doing its remarkable things on the caprock, Beatrice thought about all the choices that had brought her to this specific place and this specific evening, and not one of them seemed wrong. Even the hard ones. Even the years of being alone. Even the war. Not even the war, which she never would have chosen, had chosen her for anything other than this strength, this clarity, this capacity to recognize what was real when it was standing in front of her saying something plain as fact. In 1880, when James was 3 years old and walking around with confident chaos, Beatrice found herself expecting again. She told Aaron the same way she'd told him the first time. Thursday evening after supper. Plain as fact. He picked her up, which he had not done the first time, lifting her from the chair and holding her with his arms around her and his face in her hair. And she felt him laughing, and she was laughing too, both of them a little ridiculous about it, which was a wonderful thing to be. Their daughter arrived in January of 1881, in the same stone house, healthy and dark-haired, and they named her Margaret Virginia Malone, Virginia for the state Beatrice had come from, the life she had come from, the girl she had been before the war who had loved James and believed in a future and been called beautiful. Beatrice held Margaret in the January morning, with James peering over the edge of the bed at his new sister, with the suspicious fascination of a 3-year-old encountering something that is clearly going to permanently change his circumstances. And Aaron sat beside her on the edge of the bed with his hand in hers. And the fire was going, and the winter light was coming through the glazed windows at the low morning slant. And Beatrice looked at this small, ordinary, extraordinary room and felt the specific completion of a life that had been broken and rebuilt, and was now something she would not trade for anything. "You are going to be all right," Aaron had said to her once early in the store, when she'd been talking about some worry or another. She could no longer remember the specific worry, and it had seemed at the time like simply a thing one said. But it had turned out to be true in the largest possible sense. She was all right. She was more than all right. She had been called beautiful in the plain, honest way of a man who meant it, and it had cracked something open in her that had needed to be open, and everything that had happened after was the light that came through. The years continued, as they do. James grew into the curious, careful boy she'd predicted, And by 10 years old, he was helping Aaron with the horses with a seriousness that made his father's face do the thing Beatrice loved, the particular expression of a man watching something he deeply cares about flourish. Margaret grew into a determined and bright-eyed child who had inherited her mother's stubbornness at a concentration that was honestly somewhat alarming, and Beatrice recognized herself in her daughter with a mix of sympathy and admiration. Clara Webb, who had been helping at the store since 1876, became a genuine partner in the business by 1882, and the expanded Kendrick mercantile Beatrice had kept the name through her remarriage, because it was the name under which she had built the business, and she saw no reason to change it, was one of the best-regarded establishments in 3 counties. Known for honest prices and square dealing, and the fact that the woman who ran it had a memory like a ledger and never forgot a transaction or a debt owed in either direction. In the spring of 1883, they had a 3rd child, a boy they named Daniel, who arrived with considerable haste and volume and announced himself as a different temperament from his siblings from approximately the first hour louder, more immediately affectionate, wanting to be held by everyone and at ease with everyone who held him. A child who had decided that the world was fundamentally friendly and was going to proceed on that basis. Aaron turned 40 that year, and Beatrice was 36, and there was a supper party at the stone house on the Caprock that included the Gallaghers and Clara and her husband, a man named Hector Webb who had come to Dunnmore in 1879 and proved to be exactly the right person for Clara, and a few other people they'd accumulated into their lives over the years. And the house was full of voices, and the smell of food, and the particular richness of an evening among people who genuinely liked each other. Afterward, when the guests were gone and the children were asleep, and the house had settled back into its quiet, Beatrice stood at the window facing south over the breaks with a cup of cooling coffee, looking at the dark that covered the land, and Aaron came to stand beside her the way he always came to stand beside her, as though this was simply where he was supposed to be. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark country that stretched away from them in all directions. This Caprock land they had made their home. This place neither of them had originally been from, and both of them now completely belonged to. She was thinking about a morning in her store in October of 1875, a word said plain and certain in the morning light. "I was thinking about the first thing you said to me that mattered," she told him. He was quiet beside her. Then, "You were counting calico," he said, which told her he remembered the moment exactly. "I was supposed to be counting calico," she said. "You weren't, though." "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." She looked at him. In the window's reflection she could see both of them, side by side, the dark outside and the warm light inside. "I had not been called beautiful since before the war. I had forgotten that it was a thing anyone would say to me." He looked at her reflection in the glass. "It was simply true," he said. I didn't plan to say it, it was just observably true." "I know," she said. "That was the thing about it. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't flattery. It was just what you could see." "It's still what I can see," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him directly. This man who was 40 years old and had the same careful, formerly locked eyes that were now, after years of being slowly opened by the specific treatment of being loved well, almost entirely legible to her. She could read him like her own ledgers, knew his expressions and his silences and the specific quality of his attention. She knew him in the comprehensive way that came with years of proximity and honesty and the conscious decision to keep letting each other in. "I love you," she said plainly. The way he said things, the way she had learned to say things from being near him. "I know," he said, and he meant it as neither dismissal nor arrogance but simply as the beautiful, solid fact that it was, that after 7 years she had made it so completely clear that doubt was no longer available as a position. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, careful and certain, the way he touched things he valued. "I love you," he said in return. in case that has also become so plain as to go without saying. Say it anyway, she said. I love you, he said, plainly, as fact. She took his hand where it rested against her face and held it there, and outside the window the Caprock country lay in the dark under a sky full of stars that had been there since before any of them, before the war, before the grief, before the long years of building and rebuilding, and would be there after. The stone house was warm and the children were sleeping and the land stretched out in all directions, and Beatrice Kendrick Malone stood in the center of the life she had built and been given and chosen and kept, and it was, in the completest sense she had ever known, enough. More than enough. The life continued, the way good lives do, not in dramatic arcs but in the daily accumulation of small, real things. The children grew. The store expanded. Aaron's horse training earned a reputation beyond Dunnmore County, and men came from 50 miles to buy horses he'd worked with, because his horses were calm and well-handled and trusting, which reflected the character of the man who had trained them. The stone house was added to in 1885, a second bedroom for the children and a proper sitting room in place of the cramped corner they'd been using, and the additions were built partly by Aaron, and partly by two men he paid fair wages to and fed from Beatrice's kitchen, and the house grew in proportion to the life it contained. James, at 11, showed the first signs of the man he was going to be, which was someone with his father's patience and his mother's precision, and an additional quality of genuine warmth that seemed to be his own original contribution. Margaret, at 7, had decided that horses were her primary interest, which made Aaron happy and Beatrice resigned, because she recognized in her daughter the look of someone who has found the thing and is not going to be redirected. Daniel, at 4, loved everyone equally and was beloved in return, which seemed like a perfectly adequate way to go through the world. In 1887, on a September evening that was still warm with the last of the summer's heat, Beatrice sat on the porch of the stone house with Aaron beside her, both of them watching the breaks in the evening light, and she thought that she was 39 years old and had lived, by her own accounting, 2 lives. The first life had been the one she'd planned, the one that James had been the center of, the life that the war had ended in 1865. And the second life was this one, which she had not planned but which had been built, piece by piece, out of what she had and what she was and what the land offered and what one honest man had said on an October morning in 1875. She was grateful for both lives, she realized, not in spite of the loss but including it. Because the first life had made her who she was, and who she was had been what Aaron had seen when he looked at her, not just the beautiful he'd named so plainly, but the whole of her, the capable and the wounded and the stubborn and the brave, and what he'd seen he'd wanted not to fix or manage but simply to be near. That was the thing about love, she thought, the real kind. It did not want you to be other than you were. It wanted you to be more fully what you were, and it said so plainly as fact. The sun went down over the Caprock in colors that were almost unreasonable, orange and pink and gold, the sky doing its evening performance for an audience of 2 people on a porch who had stopped pretending that any of it was ordinary. I've been thinking, Aaron said. That's usually promising, she said. About James, he said, meaning their son, and whether this land should be his when the time comes, or whether we divide it among the 3. She thought about this with the practical intelligence she applied to all estate questions. The mercantile will go to whoever wants to run it, she said. I suspect that's Margaret, actually, despite the horses. She has the head for it. She paused. The land could be James's if he wants a ranching life. Daniel will want something else, something with more people in it. Aaron smiled because this analysis of their children was exactly correct. You may be right. I'm usually right, she said. Frequently, he agreed, without qualification, which was itself one of the things she loved about him. They sat in the evening that was cooling now as the sun went, the air carrying the smell of cedar and dry grass, and Beatrice felt the years behind her and the years ahead, and the specific, irreplaceable quality of this present moment, this porch, this man, this last light on the Caprock country. "Aaron," she said. "Yes." "I am glad you said it," she said. "That day, I am glad you just said it." He looked at her. The last of the evening light was on his face. "So am I," he said. She had not been called beautiful since before the war, and then he had said it like plain fact, and she had been afraid of what that cracking open might let in, and what it had let in was this. This life, this man, this fullness. The stars were beginning, one at a time, to appear above the Caprock in the darkening sky, and the children were inside making the sounds of children in the evening, and the land lay all around them in its old, patient vastness, and Beatrice Kendrick was not afraid any more. Had not been afraid, not in the deep-down way, for some years now. She was settled into something that held, the way good foundations hold, built carefully on honest ground, and she expected it to hold for all the years she had left. She reached over and took his hand the way she'd taken it on that January walk in 1876, and he closed his fingers around hers the way he had then, and they watched the stars come out over the breaks one by one until the sky was full of them, and the evening was quiet and warm and complete, and nothing was missing. Nothing was missing at all.